Okay.
Go ahead.
Great. Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? All right. Great. So Amy asked me to provide sort of a contextual anchor that you can think about as you're learning or reflecting on this somewhat unusual technology of blockchain and smart contracts. And so what I've done is put together a very high-level use case, is what I would call it, that describes a scenario that is intended to be very familiar, and the idea is for us to, from time to time through the day, refer back to the scenario so that you can basically have an anchor to evaluate the business context, the legal frameworks that may apply, and the technology. So first of all, what is a use case? It's here's an example of a very simple one. You have it shows a person who's a registered user of some system, and the action they're taking is editing an article. So that's a use case. This is a very common method to describe aspects of a system. In this nomenclature is unified modeling language, and while it's simple and diagrammatic, when applied completely and correctly, it affords sufficient information to actually verifiably code in any number of languages an application, and to traceably test whether the application achieves all of the intended requirements and reflects all of the constraints of the system. So it's got a lot of usefulness for that purpose. Here's a slightly more complex use case that involves two actors going through, four actors going through a food ordering process that should be familiar. This is offline. So notice there's a actor, an action, and then see that little box? That's a system boundary or a contextual boundary, so that we know the facet of the situation we're looking at. This is critical when we're doing a legal analysis. So this is the rudiments of the use case. The one that I selected is, I think, foundational to common law and to modern commercial law. It's purchase and sale of a good. So in the United States, we'd be looking to Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code, and you can extrapolate to the appropriate Canadian canon. So one thing I want to highlight for you is this little method I call BLT, not just for, because you can remember it because of bacon, lettuce, and tomato, but basically the method is to take the little stick figures and the situation and to apply the business context. So in business, you might say this person's a customer. That may be the prevailing context. Legally, they may be a consumer. Okay, there's consumer law, and there's a whole context there. Technically, they're a user. So we're going to apply this BLT context throughout the analysis. Here's applying it to the other party. The other most important thing is, I sort of gave it away in the last characterization, but in addition to these being abstract entities like customer, business, buyer, seller, they're also in a fact pattern that's a legal fact pattern that we can legally analyze to start to predict what the results would be in the event of a dispute, for example, or for some other legal analysis. They also are parties, so when we want to create the scenario, we want to say this is Jane Doe at 123 Elm Street. This is Acme Incorporated, incorporated in Toronto, something like that. So for this particular use case, what we postulate, this is a use case that came out of the MIT Media Lab a couple of years ago when we were starting with a new initiative to apply legal, to try to understand and help evolve blockchain technologies based on a legal perspective. So we're doing this through law.MIT.edu, and this particular project explored, well, first we're going to explore an entire smart contract to see if we could analyze it in a way where we could discover predictable legal results when we probe various questions. And what we ended up doing was actually narrowing it further. So you'll hear more in a moment from Matt about the fundamentals of blockchain technology, but for the moment just know that one of the capabilities of blockchain technology is that it's premised on public-private keys that every user has. Okay? They create an address on a blockchain. Well, public-private keys is great. A key capability of blockchains is that every user will digitally sign transactions and some other actions using their private key. And this creates a signature that, among other things, can be cryptographically verified, so that you know that the thing that was signed by the corresponding key, and it also allows you to know whether anything has changed based on hash technology. That does a few other things. So what we did was we basically used the public-private key pair on the Bitcoin blockchain and the Ethereum blockchain, and in a standard wallet. And we, after monkeying around a bit and messing around with the crypto, which is a little weird, as a quick aside, for those of you that are into cryptography, it's not RSA, and it's not any other common library that you might use. When we tried to do this, we discovered well, we kind of knew it was an elliptic curve, but it's SECP 256K1, if you want to try this at home. And so that's what you need to search for when you're looking for libraries or other things to try to make it sign something, and that was a whole journey. Anyway, once we finally accessed the private key material and figured out how to utilize it, we just said, okay, let's say the actors using their blockchain identity with their key pair sign just a simple PDF document with it, and the document is a contract for the sale of goods. And let's just run that through the system and see what happens if there's a dispute, and can we attribute it to the party, and what other affordances does it have? And then we had a couple of other scenarios where we then said, okay, let's say they also took that PDF contract, hashed it when it was signed, and entered that onto a blockchain. So we had some forensic evidence of it. And let's say some of the terms in the contract weren't just in PDF, but let's say they're actually being executed in a so-called smart contract. So we tried a few permutations of it, but for purposes of today, let's just stick with the simplest possible case, which is you're using the public-private key pair associated with a blockchain address. You're signing something in commerce. Is that exactly the same? Is it different? Is it better? Is it worse? Let's play it out. So how do you play it out? So what we decided to do is like a little mock trial, and we postulated that the buyers and sellers used this key pair, and they effectuated a sale of a used car that was like $10,001, or whatever the threshold was to get it over small claims courts. You could go to adult court and actually enter things into evidence and things like that. And something went terribly wrong because it's a legal fact pattern. And so, like I gave the money, I didn't get the car. I gave the car, I didn't get the money. I got the car, it was a lemon, something like that. And what we focused on was miscibility and enforceability of the signature and the contract. Just, again, basic stuff. What we discovered was a whole bunch of things. The first thing we discovered is that it's not as, well, the rhetoric around blockchain suggests it has almost mystical properties of non-repudiation and certainty, and it either avoids or somehow resolves before they can ever occur legal issues, so that we can almost float above these mundane jurisdictional wrinkles. We didn't notice any mystical properties. What we did notice was that it raised and clarified a bunch of specific issues, which I want to share with you now. I'd encourage you to think about some of these things as you're hearing about the transactions and other performance and dynamics of blockchain. One of them was, we raised the question of whether the parties had access to somebody who could actually lay a proper foundation in court. So we had, world-class cryptographers and other people. We kind of assumed various roles for the mock trial, and the person that actually coded the system, a great developer named Christian Smith, who's a recognized global thought leader in identity and digital signatures. When I was playing the counsel to help him lay the foundation, we realized, well, it's easy to just sort of assert that it's immutable, but to lay the foundation and ask question after question was actually really complicated. And by the time we were like 15 or 20 minutes into just the first few steps, we realized no judge is ever going to understand this, no jury is going to understand it, and there's just a very practical question of how do you explain this in an understandable way, and what kind of exhibits would you have that would show the salient elements of it. Amy in her framework is going to clarify some of that, but I'd say the very first most important thing is to truly understand the capabilities and the functionality of the technology such that you know it cold, and you can describe it to other people, and not overstate or understate or wrongly state what it does. Now getting a little deeper, there's a question about whether the cryptographic and other verifiable data was correctly aligned to what it is you want to prove later. And so some of these, in a blockchain, typically you'll just see that, address A paid a certain amount of money to address B. Well, if there's a dispute, you want to fill that out a little bit with, what was the agreement for, and you want to somehow link those terms to the thing that happened on a blockchain. In this case, it wasn't a big deal because, we had a bill of sale that was a standard bill of sale in the jurisdiction we played the mock trial for, that include, all the correct information you would need to establish the parties and their responsibilities and rights. But that is, that's something to think about. More going deeper, there is a question of whether the purported signatory had the requisite legal, well, first of all, authorization, like was it even their car to sell, is a question. It doesn't go away because you're using blockchain. And, were they over 18 years old? Did they have capacity? Those kinds of stuff. None of that goes away. And by going through the mock trial process somewhat methodically, we were able to identify what can we rely on blockchain for, and what do we need to apply more traditional legal practice skills in order to ensure. And then the chain of custody. I'm going to dwell on this one a little bit. So for the chain of custody, I'm just going to go forward a little bit. The most critical takeaway from this was to link the entity on a blockchain to a legal entity. So that BLT thing is very handy here. And what I mean by this is basically the legal concept is attribution. You can find this in the UNCITRAL, United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, the UNCITRAL model law on electronic commerce, which has been enacted in Canada, in the ULCA, and in the United States under Uniform Electronic Transactions Act and the e-sign Federal Act, has this concept that we call attribution. It's basically attributing an act of like a digital signature, or electronic signature, electronic contract, the act of an electronic agent to a legal party. The law takes a common law approach to this in the United States and in Canada, and it doesn't prescribe a specific method or litmus test. Like, it doesn't say you have to register it with a particular government entity, or have a registry, or use a particular technology. It's more that you have to do something that will be credible and convincing later to establish what legal party took a given action technically. So the way we did this, we didn't actually do it that well initially. We just asserted that Alice and Bob, the buyer and seller of the car, had used their private keys on a given address in the blockchain to digitally sign the contract. But then later, when I was trying to lay the foundation, I realized, like, oh, well, wait a minute, like, how do we know it was Bob's key? And the first thing that the other person did was kneecap me to say, well, that's not my client's key. should have seen that coming. But what this highlights is you want to have some kind of dual integration. So the safest way, belt and suspenders, so I think to do this would be, you could just imagine there's something in the blockchain address that maybe links to a legal party. So for example, in Bitcoin, there's a field there that is kind of a wildcard field. You can put any data in you want. You could, in an address, actually list, like this is Acme Corporation of 21 Dundas Street, Toronto, Ontario. On the transaction itself, if you were to enter a hash of the contract, you could use that field to provide a URL to where you can find the contract and read it. That provides a nice link. And similarly in the contract itself, when we revise this to do a second mock trial, which we will do eventually, under the first paragraph where we said, this contract is between, party of the first part, Alice Jones, who's doing at 123 Elm Street, comma, with this Bitcoin address and this public key, and Bob Smith at this address with this public key, and therefore blockchain address. Now we're directly linking a piece of evidence that you can enter about a legal contract and activities that are occurring and entities that exist on a blockchain. So we're integrating it both ways just to be sure. So those are some of the things that we discovered. So in closing, when you think about what if somebody was doing this commercial transaction, something happened and there was a dispute, and whether you're going to arbitration or a court of law, or just negotiating and trying to establish your position for your client, for example, or for regulators, is another spin on this. You really want to understand the roles and relationships of the parties. 1 minute. Not just user A and user B, but what are their legal roles? Is it consumer, employee? Is it licensee? What have you? The transactions. Also, just identify the actors and actions in the system, and then align those things so you understand the business, legal, and technical dimensions of what's happening. And finally, once you've identified the parties, just get like normal, just have a running list of the rights and obligations of the parties to each other. What are the causes of action? Oh, this sounds in contract, it sounds in consumer law, it sounds in securities fraud, sounds in what have you. And what are the recourse and remedies? You don't have a right if you don't have a remedy. So just think about what those would be in order to legally analyze the underlying transaction that's occurring on or through a blockchain. So that's, there you go. And we'll come back to this a little bit later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dada. I think it's so important just to wrap your head around this use case, right? As you go through the rest of the day, to come back and in your mind think about what you're learning, how that applies to this particular use case. It's just nice to anchor